why on earth are we studying 1st and 2nd Kings? If you've ever tried to read those books, you might have found them a little hard to get through. It's kind of a dry history lesson, at least that's the way it seems at first. You grew up, if you grew up in church, you grew up with the stories in Genesis and Exodus and Joshua and Judges, but these stories, it's just one king comes along and he does this and that, and he dies and his son comes along and so forth, and you think, well, that doesn't seem very relevant to our lives. It's also not the happiest book. I'll just spoil it for you. If you're hoping for a happy ending, you're not going to get it in 1st and 2nd Kings. In fact, the ending of that book, of those books, is about as bad an ending as you can imagine. So why read it? Why study it? Why? I mean, I know you know the answer because it's in the Bible, but why would we focus on it from now until May? That's my plan. There's a lot of reasons, but let me give you 3 before we dive in. The first one is because it helps tie the scriptures together and helps us to understand the rest of the Bible. For instance, if you read the Old Testament, if you read the New Testament, you read the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, in the life of Jesus, you can't fully understand it without understanding the world that Jesus grew up in. And in order to understand the world Jesus grew up in, you have to understand things like why the temple is so important and why it's so important that people are calling him the Son of David. What was the promise that was made that title is supposed to fulfill? Where do these people, the Pharisees and Sadducees, come from? And why are they so passionate about these different issues? And what about the prophets? If you read the whole prophetic part of the Old Testament, almost all of those guys prophesied during the time period we're studying. And you can't understand a word they're saying unless you know what they're talking about, unless you know the circumstances they came from. And most of all, there's the exile. I'll spoil it for you. The story ends with Israel losing everything and being carted away to a foreign land. And that is a formative event in the history of the people of God. So Jesus grew up in a world where everybody thought back to that. Of course, they weren't alive then, but they told stories about when our ancestors lived in Babylon, and then when they came home, and then when they rebuilt the temple, and all those things you have to understand if you really want to grasp the things Jesus did and said and why. There's a second reason. Because it shows us the importance of character in our leaders. The book of 1st and 2nd Kings, it's a list of the different rulers of Judah and Israel and what they did, right and wrong. And what you find out is when a nation has a leader who is a man of character or a woman of character, it is good for that nation. And when the character of the leader is weak, the nation suffers. Now, sometimes not economically or militarily, sometimes outwardly, an unrighteous ruler can seem successful, but the ultimate impact of their ruling is always negative. And you'll see this in this book. Part of why I chose this, and y'all know me by now that I don't do partisan politics from the pulpit, but part of why I chose this was I was thinking, well, what study should I do during an election year? And I thought 1st and 2nd Kings. It's important for us to remember when we go to the polls. I mean, character matters. Character of our leaders matters, and we should pay attention to that. The third reason is, and kind of in contrast to that second reason, no matter who's on the throne, God is still king. That's what we see in 1st and 2nd Kings. Because yes, sometimes the rulers of Judah and Israel are righteous. More often they're not. And sometimes the people thrive and prosper, and sometimes they suffer. But in spite of all of that, God still accomplishes his will. In spite of all the mistakes that the rulers of Israel make that we're going to study over the next several months, Jesus still came out of Israel and still died for our sins, still ransomed humanity, still rose from the grave. Nothing can stop the plans of God. And that ought to give us a sense of peace. If you are worried about the state of our nation, if you're worried about who's going to win in November, just remember that stuff is important. But no matter what happens then, God's still on his throne. God is still going to accomplish his will, and it doesn't change our mission as God's people. So those are my 3 reasons. You can probably find others, but that's why I wanted us to study 1st and 2nd Kings.